A Kannada-speaking king died in 973 CE after starving himself for 3 days at his guru's monastery. His name was Marasimha II and his kingdom was based near present-day Bengaluru. Marasimha, according to his court poet, had spent his life in war. He had participated in campaigns in Madhya Pradesh, slaughtered rival families, even piled up the skulls of his enemies. But in his last year of life, he had erected Jain temples and his ritual suicide was in a Jain monastery. Within a few decades of Narasimha's death, his kingdom had disappeared, but Deccan Jainism continued to retain its following for almost 500 more years. This is one part of its story. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti, historian and author of Lords of the Deccan. Welcome to Thinking Medieval, where every week we tell you something new about our complex, innovative past. Always feel free to check out our research and citations below, and remember that we're all figuring out how to think about our messy, bloody, dazzling history. By the time of Marasimha's death, Deccan Jainism was already a grand old religion, counting among its adherents the plateau's most powerful rulers, ascetics, and literators. Historian R.N. Nandi writes in Religious Institutions and Cults in the Deccan that Jain monks began to appear in inscriptions from the 4th to 5th century CE. Also around this time, other practices from North India, including permanent stone temples to gods and the use of Sanskrit in political settings, appeared in the Deccan. All these offered potent symbolic and political tools to newly emerging kingdoms such as the Kadambas in present-day Banavasi and the early Western Chalukyas in present-day Badami. Deccan Jainism was woven into medieval South Indian kingship from the outset. In Bahubali and Badami Chalukyas, Jainism scholar Hampa Nagarajaya notes that one of the earliest freestanding examples of Deccan architecture is Jain. It's a temple on the Meguti hill at Aihole, built in the 7th century by Ravikirti, a Jain courtier of the Chalukya king Pulakeshin II. The temple's dedicatory inscription was composed by Ravikirti in Sanskrit. It shows that he was familiar with the political aesthetic of the Sanskrit cosmopolis, the sprawling medieval geocultural world that connected Sanskrit-speaking courts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. The Meguti hill, where Ravikirti built his temple, was the most prominent part of Aihole town and had been a sacred site from the Iron Age centuries prior. You can actually still see megalithic graves on the hill outside Ravikirti's compound. Now, all this suggests that Aihole's 7th century Jain community was powerful and well-connected. Inscriptions from across Karnataka show that Jain orders migrated there from Varanasi, from Bengal and Gujarat. Just like Vedic Brahmins, Jains' inter-polity connections must have been very useful to kings. Deccan Jains were aware of the contradiction between their non-violent principles and the martial political systems that granted them patronage. As such, they spilled much ink in exploring the ambiguities of power and the duties of the ruler. Let's look at one of these texts, the Adipurana of the Digambara monk Jainasena, studied by historian Paul Dundas in his chapter The Digambara Jain Warrior, part of the edited volume The Assembly of Listeners, Jains in Society. The Adipurana was a mytho-historical text about Rishabha, the first Jain Tirthankara, and the succession struggle between his sons Bharata and Bahubali. Bharata is depicted as the first world conqueror, overcoming his enemies, but this is often shown to be inferior to his father Rishabha's overcoming of spiritual obstacles such as passion and greed. Overcome by his hunger to rule, Bharata challenges Bahubali to a duel but cheats. Bahubali still wins, but at the moment of his victory, he realizes the transience of kingship and becomes a renunciant. Sobered, Bharata returns to his court and lectures his warriors on the duties of kingship. Warriors, according to Jainasena through Bharata's mouth, are descended from the spiritual conqueror, the Tirthankara Rishabha. So they should set their minds solely on Jainism, the true path to liberation. The king must protect the devout, namely the Jain community, yes, but also his other subjects. He must not resist more powerful neighbors, but surrender because war is bad for the people. Jainasena also warns kings away from what he calls Aksharam Lecha, literally letter barbarians, by which he means Vedic Brahmins, and I quote here, who live off the Veda, delude people by reciting words of unrighteousness, and take pride in their false scriptural knowledge, delighting in violence and meat-eating. On the other hand, Jain Brahmins, he claims, were excellent due to their good qualities rather than their birth, and they were to be respected. Now, how much of this was polemic? It's difficult to be sure, but clearly Jain scholars saw Hindu Brahmins as rivals, while also borrowing some ideas of caste hierarchy and purity. Jinasena's patron, the powerful Rashtrakuta Emperor Amoghavasha I, must have been quite pleased with the idea that weaker kings should submit to the stronger. The Rashtrakuta court financed spectacular Jain cave temples at Ellora, still worth a visit today. And Jinasena's narration of the Bahubali legend, as we'll see in a future edition of Thinking Medieval, proved tremendously influential. King Marasimha II, who died in 973 CE, was an ally and relation of the Rashtrakuta emperors. He was not the only medieval aristocrat to ritually starve himself after a career of war and violence. Dozens of Deccan inscriptions attest that monks, laymen, and laywomen performed Jain austerities before death. It appears that Jainism was genuinely held to offer liberation and coexisted with other beliefs. Hero stones show that Deccan aristocrats also believed that valiant warriors were carried to heaven by Apsara damsels. So why was Jain ritual suicide so popular? An answer comes from the Harivamsabhyudaya of Bandhuvarma around 1200 CE, a Jain retelling of the Mahabharata legend studied by Professor S. Settar in Pursuing Death, Philosophy and Practice of Voluntary Termination of Life. Pandu, the father of the Pandavas, is described as a Jain initiate who decides to give up the world. Accompanied by his junior wife Madri, Pandu goes to a Jain temple, circumambulates it and takes vows. Senior teachers are assigned to supervise his food intake and to see to his religious instruction. Then he begins to quite literally battle the senses in preparation for death. Like the knight decorated with the headband giving invitation to his enemy, I'm quoting here, he meditates on the futility of samsara, the material world. Like the hero piercing and bleeding his enemy, he sheds the blood of inauspicious karma with the sharp tip of auspicious concentration. Settar also notes that before ritual starvation, Jain initiates were asked to confess their sins and absolve themselves. In the warlike world of the medieval Deccan, we shouldn't underestimate the spiritual relief that this may have offered, especially given that it was tailored to the warrior mind. The final renunciant was the greatest conquest of their careers. But in this text, we also see that the Jain Deccan community, while also excoriating Brahmins, had many elements we might think of as Hindu. It had temples and circumambulation. We know from inscriptions that Deccan Jain idols like Deccan kings and like Shivalingas received ritual ablutions. And the adaptation of Mahabharata legends also indicates that Jains shared a common cultural substrate with their Brahmin rivals. Medieval religiosity must have been quite fluid. It may have only been religious leaders like Jinasena that saw their communities as exclusive, while most people picked up and patronized whichever traditions appealed to them. Many paths offered liberation and peace to the dying. In Marasimha's case, we're also told, somewhat amusingly, that his suicide was a great relief to his enemies. I quote here, "Aho, Chola king, quiet down by gently rubbing thy palpitating heart. O Pandya, give up weeping. O Pallava, run not away in fear, retreat not from thy territory but remain. The Ganga chieftain has gone in triumph to the abode of the gods." If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and at Connected Histories, and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.